12 days of dueling strikes, 3 nuclear sites destroyed, and one message loud and clear from the President of the United States. America will not stand by while the world's top state sponsor of terror builds a nuclear bomb. But now the bombs have stopped. The ceasefire, though fragile, appears to be holding. And just before boarding Air Force One for the NATO summit, President Trump was asked if he wanted to see regime change in Iran.
I'd like to see everything calm down as quickly as possible. Regime change takes chaos, and ideally we don't want to see so much chaos, so we'll see how it does. You know, the Iranians are very good traders, very good business people, and they got a lot of oil. They should be fine. They should be able to rebuild and do a good job.
He's made it clear. America isn't going to dictate who rules Iran, only eliminate a clear and present nuclear threat. We're not in the business of endless wars or open-ended missions. So now comes the bigger question. What happens next for Iran? If the Ayatollahs stay the course, more devastation is inevitable. But if the Iranian people, those who have suffered for decades, rise up and chart a different path, a freer, more prosperous Iran could emerge. One that embraces peace, regional trade, and the prosperity of its own people instead of the hatred of others. Waiting in the wings is a man who believes in that vision. His Royal Highness Reza Pahlavi, the exiled Crown Prince of Iran. He spent years preparing for this moment. And now, as the regime falters, he may represent Iran's best chance at a new beginning.
There's only one way to achieve peace: a secular, democratic Iran. I am here today to submit myself to my compatriots, to lead them down this road of peace and democratic transition.
I had the privilege of speaking with His Royal Highness to discuss the future of his country as it sits at a critical crossroads. Well, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, thank you so much for joining us tonight on My View. We're so excited to talk to you. You know, you've been in exile, I think, as so many of us know, since 1979. But maybe you can remind all of us what once upon a time Iran was like before the revolution. What was it like to live there? Give all of us a little bit of insight.
Hi, Lara. Thank you for having me on your program. Well, in a nutshell, I think every Iranian remembers how Iran was flourishing and progressing with great relationship with our neighbors, and particularly with the United States. And all of a sudden, of course, the revolution happened, which changed everything. But a country that was progressing, was on the road to development, was faced with being taken hostage by this regime that has usurped our land and since then have been wreaking havoc and chaos in the region and beyond.
Yeah, and I know you've said before that there can be no hope for a better future as long as this current regime is in place. So give us an idea of overall what you would like to see happen for the betterment of your country.
Well, the key issue is that you are facing with a regime that its DNA simply cannot be on par with the values of freedom, of democracy, of human rights as we wish it as a nation. And that's why the obstacle between us and the free world and rejoining it is a regime that has repressed us from the beginning and continues to bring havoc and terrorism, and we've seen it all these years. So the solution to the problem, to eliminate anything that will be threatening to Iran's national interests as well as world security, and particularly the United States, is for this regime that from its inception has called for America's death. Death to America was the slogan, unlike a nation that actually loves America, a nation that would like to see a fruitful relationship with it. The only country that, when 9/11 happened, stood in sympathy with the victims of that attack by lighting candlelight vigil. What a difference a free Iran would be with this vision of a future with our friends and, of course, the United States, as opposed to this regime. So I think we have to put an end to this regime, which is at its weakest today. It's on the brink of collapse, and this creates a unique opportunity for Iranians to finally deliver themselves and take their country back.
And do you think that most people in Iran are ready for that? Is that where the sentiments of most people who live there right now lie?
Absolutely. I think the Iranian people who have paid a dear price all this time and have suffered a lot under this regime and have very bravely and courageously tried to fight it and have many times been pretty much repressed, see the light at the end of the tunnel. And as I said earlier, this regime right now is on the brink of collapse. And I think people are beginning to think that there's now an opportunity to get this done. Of course, a key element has always been the repressive regime that this regime has had against its own citizenry, and most of its establishment, its security establishment, its element of repression has been practically neutralized right now. And that evens up the playing field. It has never been a question for people to no longer want this regime in their majority. It's now an opportunity that they have where they will face far less resistance or repression by the regime. Not that it's completely eliminated, but it's much, much less than it was before, which is why I think this time they see that they might have a true opportunity to bring about finally this change.
And if this current regime does fall, what do you feel needs to happen to ensure that there doesn't, there's not a vacuum, there's no more, brutal leadership that comes in on the back end and you see the same sort of thing happen again? What would you like to see happen to ensure true freedom there in Iran?
Look, the principle of what we stand for, which I think unites and galvanizes all Iranians from all walks of life, are three core principles, which is Iran territorial integrity, which is individual freedoms and equality of all citizens under the law, and of course separation of religion from state. On that basis, we can galvanize all those who are against this regime towards a democratic future. And my plan is in this transition role, both now until this regime collapse, but particularly after the collapse, to have an organized, stable transition to make sure that the void will be filled with a plan of action, whether it's the first 100 days after the regime collapses, and bringing as many elements into play that will be part of this transition and particularly can survive regime change. Unlike what happened in Iraq, we are calling for something totally different, which is why one of my messages, and especially since the recent military campaign, for all those who want to now peel away from the regime and join us, people in the military, in the security forces, the civilian bureaucracy, and of course the rest of our people across the land, to come together in a unified campaign, which is also another thing I'll be hosting very soon, to really agree on a roadmap to this transition and have maximum participation so all voices will be heard, and ultimately we'll have a constitutional process which will ultimately determine by means of referendum what the majority of the Iranian people will have as an option to choose. This is the roadmap to that direction, and I've stepped in to take the leadership of this transition, and I'm looking forward to work with all forces who are ready and able to work together in a coalition of the willing.
Well, before we let you go, I do want to ask you, we had that great military campaign, as you just alluded to, taking out these Iranian nuclear sites. We have heard, though, that you have, actors like Russia out there and maybe other adversaries to the United States saying, well, we would be able to supply Iran with a nuclear warhead. What do you think the American people should know? What do you want maybe the world to know about this regime's relationship with Russia, with China, with North Korea, with, those that we consider true adversaries out there around the world?
Well, again, it goes to the point of why this regime should no longer continue to be, because right now you have a winded beast that has been humiliated, that will seek retaliation first and foremost against its own citizenry, but not to mention spread that revenge, if I could call it that, particularly aimed at the West and particularly America. So what I'm thinking here is to say for Americans to know that the Iranian people, unlike this regime, are your friends. We are allied in vision and in principle, and the sooner this regime is gone, there will no longer be any reason for any American to feel insecure about what kind of harm can this regime bring, not just to U.S. interests, but to everybody in the region. And that is the commitment that Iranians have to prove the world that this time, why don't you count on us? We are the agent of change. Unlike this regime, we seek peace, we seek stability, and the best of relationship with the United States, which, by the way, we had before the revolution. And I know many Americans remember that. People in your military, people who had remember what Iran was like, the kind of relationship we had, were the first one to be targeted by this regime. The first thing this regime did was to take hostages in the embassy in Tehran. And since then, they've been menacing. Thousands of American personnel have been killed during all these years. So I think this is where we can say that a different Iran will be committed to work closely and with the best of intentions with our neighbors and, of course, with the United States of America that has a particular place in our hearts. And Iranians have proven time and again, when they chant, they lie to us, it's America, our enemy is right here, meaning they know exactly the difference between what this regime has in terms of evil intentions, particularly guided to America, as opposed to a liberated Iran that will prove to the world, and particularly to America, that we are your friends. And this time, look at us as the solution, as opposed to hope that this regime will ever change its behavior.
We like the sound of that. That is for sure. Crown Prince, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate the time, and best of luck with everything that you have moving forward.
Much appreciated, Lara. Thank you.